Hi, welcome back to the Waffle Press Movie Hangouts. I don't have an official name for what I'm going to call this segment of the Waffle Press Movie Podcast, but I'm your host, Diego Crespo, and with me I have a very special guest today, Soren from Movie Fail. How are you doing today, man?
I'm doing all right. I'm excited to do this. We really only know each other from Twitter, so this is kind of exciting to get into a discussion.
Yeah, and we whether or not we agree on certain movies and such, I think we get some really good discussions out of certain movies and television shows. I discovered your guys' Movie Fail podcast through The Legend of Korra when that was airing last year in 2014, and there were a lot of harsh things being said about the show when, in reality, seasons 3 and 4 were pretty fantastic, and your guys' podcast was like a lifesaver in that regard, you and Josh Rosenfield, who I know from audiences everywhere.
Right.
Also, check out Movie Fail, Soren, and Josh's podcasts. They're great. They're great. Their Game of Thrones stuff really well done also, because I think some people were kind of blinded by Faith this season and didn't really talk about how bad some of the material was.
Yeah, it was a hit or miss season. That's definitely true. But thank you so much for saying all of that. It's So I'm editor in chief over at Movie Fail. That's what I do with my, I don't want to call it free time, but it is what I do with my free time. And then in the meantime, I do cancer research at UMass Medical School. So I have like this very strange background when it comes to film. But I did major in both film studies and microbiology, so I guess I'm using both of my degrees.
Oh, hey, that's good, man. You're putting it to good use.
Yeah, there you go.
And I believe it was like a week or so ago. Well, we talked about it before when the movie came out. Age of Ultron was a pretty big hit for this summer. Surprisingly, not the biggest hit. Jurassic World came out of nowhere, but it divided a lot of people. Some people think it's the best Marvel movie. Some people think it's the worst. And then there's you and I who maybe not think it's the best or the worst, but contender for both of those categories. I am very positive on it. I've discussed it plenty of times on Twitter, on Facebook, pretty much everywhere I could, because I think it is one of the more meaty, thematic Marvel movies. It gives me a lot to chew on. Whether or not the execution's always good I think the quality varies on certain characters and arcs, and I know some people have a lot to say about Ultron as a villain. I'm a big fan of this movie. I'll just get my thoughts out of the way first, and then you can go ahead with yours. Just to recap my thoughts, Age of Ultron, I think, is not the best Marvel movie, but it might be the one I go back to the most. Each theatrical viewing, I think I saw it 3 or 4 times. I can't remember.
Wow.
I really enjoyed it. It doesn't have the cheer-worthy moments of the first, but it has a lot of character. Maybe not as much heart as the first either, but I think we're past the heart, and now we need to see these characters be tested, and we need to see the way the world reacts to them, which we actually don't get that much of in Age of Ultron either. But the way the characters' deepest fears and their failures manifest within the character of Ultron isn't so literal as it is just metaphorical, and that's where I think Ultron as a villain really wins me over. He's not that much of a fleshed out character. He's just a robot who's angry at humanity and thinks the Avengers are causing all this nonsense. But I think the movie does at least a good job of shining the light on maybe the Avengers are the problem. Maybe they are monsters causing more harm than good. And that's what really sells me on the movie, I guess. I think Joss Whedon gets a little heavy slack for his treatment of certain characters. I know the Black Widow part is a big point of contention, and I'm not 100% on board with what he did with the character, but I do think that it's not mishandled too well, or not mishandled too poorly. I think, though her character arc is intrinsically tied with Bruce Banner's, Black Widow does get some interesting character moments, some really sad stuff. I mean, her whole little arc in the first Avengers is her trying to become a hero when she was just a villain. We never see her villainous side. We just see her trying to redeem herself for past mistakes and the red in her ledger and all that classic stuff we love to refer to. And here now she's wondering if she can ever have anything else. Can she ever redeem herself? Like she's on the path to redemption, but is there an end there? Is there a real life for her? And I'll stop rambling on and on, but I think Age of Ultron is maybe not the Empire Strikes Back of the Marvel movies. I think that's Winter Soldier, if anything. But it's a movie that has a lot of ideas, and it's more focused on those ideas than it is establishing giant set-piece battles. And the movie has plenty of those, too. But I'll let you go on ahead. I'm rambling on too much. What are your thoughts on Age of Ultron?
Well, so I've seen the movie twice now. When I first saw it, I will say I came away, I was disappointed. Disappointed in some regard, very irritated in others. My anger has since ebbed when it comes to the film, but it's hard to really describe my feelings about Age of Ultron now that I've seen it 2 times. At least before, there was some sort of I had some strong emotion about it. At this point, I'm kind of just lukewarm about the entire thing. But I do think it represents a lot of problematic things in the Marvel universe. It represents, and on a meta sort of level, on people behind the camera and that sort of thing. That before now, with the exception of Iron Man 2, which I think is even more egregious in a lot of the problems that we see in Age of Ultron. So it's not quite as bad as Iron Man 2. But it's very similar in a lot of ways, and I think we can tackle as many of them as you want. But one of the problems with Iron Man 2, one of the things a lot of people criticized it for, is that it felt like an extended trailer for the Avengers, it was introducing all of the Avengers Initiative. There was a lot of Nick Fury. There was a lot of you could call it world building, but really it's franchise building. It felt like what story there was, and it is an interesting story to tell about Tony Stark and his battle with alcoholism was clouded by the need to build the rest of this universe. And it really just sank the movie to the point where it's very hard to even describe the plot of the film because it's so focused on what's going to happen next. And to me, that's Age of Ultron, not on quite the same level, but you even get some of the same problems. So, you mentioned, the way Joss Whedon treated some of his characters, quote unquote, but really we're talking about Black Widow.
Yeah.
And, on revisiting it, I'm less upset with the film on that front. But even there, we have a parallel with Iron Man 2, which really they didn't know what they were doing with Black Widow at all in that movie. She was, a set piece. Oh, she's actually a spy, but mostly she was, eye candy for all of these, whoever they envision their audience to be, this largely, young male audience. And so I think that you get some of that here. And in fact, it's something that, we can address at some point is, Age of Ultron feels like a movie from a different era, from an era, and not in a good way, not in like, oh, the golden age. No, like it doesn't in 2015 when we have films like Mad Max or Ex Machina or all these other really interesting films that deal with things like gender in a way that's not, it's overt in some ways, but it's not the focus of the film per se. It just feels like, a dinosaur, and not to, make a pun out of it, but it's the same with Jurassic World, which I found less disagreeable in this regard. But, these are movies that they don't need, we know that you can make a compelling blockbuster that is going to appeal to a wide base, and still be conscious of even simple things like how you frame shots, how you so that they're not objectifying people, so that specifically women, and so their storytelling isn't at the expense of agency and things like that. So, Iron Man 2 came out at a very different time, I think. We were almost by 2018, we're going to be 10 years into the Marvel Universe, and we're still seeing the same things again and again, and I feel like that's a problem. The one other thing I just want to mention is the other parallel we have with Iron Man 2, and I keep comparing it to Iron Man 2 because I think I hear people defending a lot of Marvel movies with Thor 2 is actually not so bad, or Thor was actually good. I still don't understand that one. But with Iron Man 2, I feel like people are sort of united on their disinterest in that film, and so when I compare it to that, the other half of this is one of my criticisms, ironically, of the first Avengers is that the script feels like a Joss Whedon script, almost at the expense of some of the characters. It feels like he's foisting his own, little linguistic things on the characters, but it doesn't influence how they act. It influences their dialogue to the point where it's perhaps a little on the nose, but ultimately, he seemed like he was a good fit for that universe. There's very little Whedon in this film, and that's really what bothers me, just like there was very little Favreau in Iron Man 2. That at the point where a director with such a distinct, one of the things Favreau is so well known for is his sort of improvisational dialogue, where they have the framing of the dialogue, but when they actually get into the conversation, it feels snappy and quick. And that's something we saw a lot of in Iron Man, not the first Iron Man, and we saw it in Iron Man 2. But something about the storytelling just wasn't there. They lost the writers, etc., etc. In this case, we do have Joss Whedon, but it feels like so much of this film was put to him and said, this is part of what needs to be in this movie, and if you can't make it work, we're going to have a problem. This needs to be in it. And so you lose so much of that vision. You lose so much of that. And we have, our mutual friend, Josh Rosenfield, feels this is every Marvel film. I think in this case, it came to the surface in a much more tangible way. And I mentioned that I feel like this is a representation of what could be a slippery slope for Marvel, in that they can stop caring about narrative and stop caring about the things that make a good movie, and just be obvious about the fact that they're trying to set up Phase 3, or they're trying to set up whatever the next thing is. And that we'll get another Age of Ultron in Civil War. I don't know if that's the case, but I think that is going to be a big turning point. Now, I haven't seen it yet, but I did hear that Ant-Man was a step in the right direction as opposed to the wrong direction in terms of making it feel like a standalone feature. But that's basically my big quibble with Age of Ultron. I have a bunch of different problems, but it feels like, much like Jurassic World, actually, a sort of made by committee film that loses a lot of identity of the characters, of the director, etc. So that's where I am with it.
All right. Well, let's just talk about its place in the Marvel Universe then, and how that committee-like feel. Because I disagree with that. I think there's absolutely stuff that got cut, and there were certain mandates that needed to be asked of Joss Whedon, who I think did a pretty solid job on the first script. It's not a breathless script. It's not too tight, but it's the kind of loose, fun summer blockbuster. It's one of the best summer blockbusters, I think, because it's not on par with like Mad Max, but that's probably not a fair comparison. But he's got a really fun sense of the universe, I think, in the first Avengers. This one, I think he takes time to look at each of the characters' personal lives, and I think the biggest mistake in the movie, for me actually, is, as much as I love it, the climactic battle shouldn't be about saving the world. I think it should be about saving the Avengers. And it shouldn't have been the giant smashy globe Sokovia turning into a meteorite. As great as that is, and as I think it is, and as effective as some of those moments are, Ultron is written to be an unstoppable machine to crush the Avengers and exterminate them, just eradicate them. When he turns his look to humanity, I don't know if that's earned too well. Sure, it's happening.
I actually agree with that. I think that's part of the problem with James Spader's Ultron, is that he's really excellent. I love James Spader. I think he's a great actor, and I thought he was a perfect choice for this. And the trailers, which by the way mix quotes in ways that don't actually happen in the movie, unfortunately.
Yeah, I hate when they do that.
It's unfortunate because they were really good lines. I was like, this is really good writing, but then the movie didn't use them. But I think he's really great for about half a movie, and then he sort of almost gets sidelined in a weird way, to the point where he's doing he becomes a sort of cartoonish villain, which of course is a little silly to say about a comic book villain. But there are comic book villains that are really interesting and fleshed out, and I think that Ultron actually is one of them in the comics. And from what I understand, I'm not a avid comic book reader, but from TV shows and other interpretations of the character and what I know about him from other sources, very interesting.
Ultron is probably the quintessential Avengers villain. So at 2013 Comic Con when they announced it was going to be called Age of Ultron. One, I was like, oh crap, it's named after that crappy run of comics that happened like a month ago. And then two was Ultron is the best Avengers villain, so this is a perfect fit. And then they announced James Spader, and yeah, that was a great choice. And I still think Ultron's used effectively. I just think he's you didn't have to go that way with the character. To me, it's still effective, and I guess because the stakes, while they're going around saving a bunch of innocent people still, and I think some people think that's an overreaction to Man of Steel. I just think that was good superhero movie writing, saving civilians. I don't know why.
I was going to say, honestly, I don't think it was a reaction to Man of Steel. I think that's I mean, first of all, I don't think the productions line up enough for it to be a reaction to Man of Steel. I think that was just part of the story.
Yeah, I think everyone's, or maybe not everyone, but a lot of people are concerned with like the Marvel versus DC mindset, and then that's just not how the world works. Well,
and also it's just it's not a worthwhile conversation. But I will say, even if that is your perspective, I mean, how do you explain the entire scene with the Hulk running through the whole fight, the Hulkbuster Hulk fight? Entire buildings are destroyed. He checks one of the buildings that he's going to smash into and says, "Oh, it's not. There's no one in it." But people are everywhere. Cars are everywhere. They're throwing things at each other. To suggest he does save people throughout the fight, but to suggest that, there wasn't mass destruction even just in that one little scene.
Oh yeah.
It's crazy. So I mean, it's silly. It's silly.
Yeah. And I quite like that because there it's used, I think, effectively enough to note that they're not being the best heroes they could be. They're screwing up, and they can't beat this guy. Ultron's really getting under their skin, and at the end of the fight, I don't know how you feel about this, but I really feel that with Scarlet Witch's visions and Ultron unleashing the Hulk on South Africa, I believe, that the Avengers are really hurting, and I felt that hurt in the aftermath of all that destruction. It wasn't just mindless.
So I have a lot of problems with the visions and how it came out. I have a problem with the vision, the character, but I also have a problem with the visions and how they came about, or how they manifested in the story. I have a huge problem with, and this will probably warrant a little bit more discussion. I have a huge problem with Tony's vision feeling like an exact retread of Iron Man 3, which, by the way, I think is one of the best Marvel movies. So,
undoubtedly.
Just for perspective. Okay, so we agree on that.
Yeah.
So that's one thing aside.
Well, Iron Man 3 being one of the best Marvel movies, I disagree with the vision, but
right.
We'll get back to that.
Right. Yeah, I knew what you meant. But I don't think that... So it's a retread. So yeah, it folds into the plot in a way that fits the plot, I suppose, but it feels like very redundant. It feels like it's very redundant. And then with Captain America and with Thor, I mean, these visions are irrelevant. I mean, what happens with Thor is relevant in that it helps lead to the vision's creation, but ultimately the meaning of that is sort of irrelevant to the story. And even if it is relevant, Thor's role in the vision's birth or creation or whatever you want to call it is tangential almost. I mean, he's the one who uses lightning to make give him power, but it's just such a side point, and it feels like such a setup for Thor Ragnarok. It's just shameless promotion. The whole thing with Wakanda as well. This isn't a Vision thing, but the whole thing with Wakanda and introducing Claw and all of these other storylines. I mean, it's just it doesn't feel like world building. It feels like franchise building in a very almost manipulative way, where they're like, "Oh, this is a new place. You don't know about it," as opposed to. When Banner screws up the name, can't pronounce Wakanda, the whole thing. It just, to me, it didn't really work. And we can even talk about Vibranium, which to me is like a whole other problem with the film. It doesn't make any sense at all. But to me, the visions didn't really lead to the character growth that it seems like you're suggesting. And moreover, I don't think the characters grew all that much. I don't think any of them really did. I think what growth we saw from Captain America all came from the Winter Soldier. I don't find it in this film. I think everything with Black Widow was mostly predicated on her relationship with Bruce Banner, which again is its own issue. Bruce had a little bit of growth, but he was the Hulk was manipulated by Scarlet Witch, but there was no vision for us to really grab onto. We only saw the aftermath of his destruction, which is, again, something we've seen time and time again. I mean, this is a recurring theme with the Hulk, which might point to why he's not so great for solo film outings, but it's kind of not all that interesting to me. So there's a lot of... It didn't really... if there was more to grab onto, if there was more for Scarlet Witch to really dig into and help the other characters develop, I might agree, but to me, there wasn't any meaningful development.
All right. Well, I definitely don't think there was any positive development for anybody besides the twins, Captain America, and Hawkeye. I think everyone else pretty much leaves the movie in shambles. Let me get into that with Black Widow, first of all. Yeah, her entire arc is absolutely just intrinsically tied to Bruce Banner. And while I think it is handled pretty well, it's a bummer that it's just tied to Bruce Banner and her relationship there. Like, yeah, she's trying to of course, redeem herself for past sins. That's classic Black Widow stuff, but it's something we've seen before. And while I think it's handled well here, we have seen it before, and it's a bummer that it's still tied to a male character. I can agree with that. For the Thor stuff, that I feel like we would be better off if 80% of his story wasn't cut. That's what it feels like, anyways.
Right,
So
and I've heard
snippets.
that. I've heard that before, and they keep talking about how there'll be this extended cut on the Blu-ray, but I ultimately don't care, right? Because I saw the theatrical edition, and everyone else did. That's what they're paying for, and that's the version that was presented to us. So while there will be a director's cut, it's hard to excuse something for something that we don't see. Like, how about we cut out, Claw, or how about we cut out, like, just unnecessary things that are not, and instead flesh out this storyline, which is apparently so important you can't rewrite it into something that actually makes sense in the story. So I feel like that it's sort of an easy way out for, not that Whedon has said this, but to use it as it's not the version I wanted to do, but, I had to cut things because of time constraints.
Yeah, and I think he's gone on record saying, like, he doesn't see it happening anytime soon, the director's cut. He's tired.
I thought that was...
Yeah, no, I think he's done with Marvel. I'm pretty sure Age of Ultron tired him out, whether or not he made a
and you
good
could
or bad
feel
movie.
it.
Yeah,
you could feel it.
Just feel strained at times, undoubtedly. But
where you could just see there was things he had to do. He was like, "Oh, I have to incorporate this. How am I going to get this in here?" I mean, how they got the Vision into this movie, it just blows my mind, and not in a good way. It makes great. I love Paul Bettany. I think he, when he first shows up, when he flies at the window and immediately stops in front of the window, that's really cool. But the whole origin of his birth, why Ultron's even creating him in the first place, it makes no sense. Even as something as simple as the concept of vibranium, there's that whole, little exposition about, vibranium can, works really well with organic tissue to, why? Why does it do that? Why is that necessary? Why doesn't Ultron just make his army out of vibranium soldiers, which would make his army far more imposing and why isn't he constantly upgrading? He does once, as far as we can, or twice.
Twice, yeah, which is a bummer. I expected him to do.
It's a whole thing with
just
him.
That. Yeah,
right.
He's constantly
goes
upgrading
from
himself and such.
Right, Ultron 5, Ultron 6, that whole thing.
Yeah, they're like on Ultron 50 or whatever in the comics, and we get 3 versions, which I'm okay with that. I can put aside the comic stuff, the film stuff, but
I don't care about accuracy. It's just that might have made it more. I mean, it's such a jolt to see him as this broken robot, and suddenly they're doing some random Crimson Cowl reference. I mean, what was that?
Oh, I thought that
ridiculous.
Was fine. I don't think that's an issue.
It's not an issue, but to me, it's that's the kind of thing that this movie really. It irritates me when there's comic book fan service that doesn't make any sense to people who haven't read the comics. So the Vision as an entire character in this, I think, definitely fits in that boat. But even things like the Crimson Cowl, why are we doing this whole scene where he's in a church and it feels very shoehorned. I'll give you a good example of something that fits beautifully, that is from the comics, from what I understand. Again, I'm not a comic book expert by any means, but there's the quote that Hawkeye says when he's talking to Scarlet Witch, when he says something like, this is going on, that's going on, and I have a bow and arrow, and none of this makes any sense. And it's funny. It works really well in the scene. It makes sense. It builds on something we saw a little bit earlier with Hawkeye and his wife, where she's like, you're a human being trying to be with all of these superpowered people, except for Natasha, and it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And so he's building on that, and it's a quote that both ties into from the comics, but if you haven't read the comics, it still makes sense. People who haven't read the comics or didn't watch Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, which by the way is awesome if anyone hasn't seen it. It's an excellent series. I
need to finish it, but yes, I agree.
It's so good. It's so good, right? That's how I'm up on a lot of these characters. But if I hadn't, the entire creation of Vision just feels like it's out of nowhere. It's just, yeah. So anyway, that's just, and it feels like Joss Whedon is either, I don't know if it's a Marvel Studios telling him to do this, or if he's like, oh yeah, we're comic book geeks, we all know these references. But the problem is, it's an entire character who apparently is important to the story by the end of it, but it doesn't really make, or the movie seems to imply he's important to the story, but it never really justifies his existence or the entire focus on his creation. So yeah, and that's really what irritates me about the movie, is that it feels like a lot of, I don't want to. There's a word I want to use, but it's not really appropriate. But it doesn't feel organic. It doesn't feel natural. It doesn't feel like filmmaking. It feels like, look how cool it is that we have Vision fighting next to Thor, fighting next to the Hulk in that ridiculous slow motion scene in the church.
Oh, okay.
That kind
no. I'll get to that. But I think that scene is as a huge standout alongside Dan
standout in a good way.
Like in a good way.
In a good way. Okay,
yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, but back to the characters, because I actually quite like the use of Vision, but Thor's stuff, because he's the weak link of the movie. I think across the board, he's the weak link, and it's not.
But at least he's funny. At least he's. Oh yeah, no. I love Chris.
His arc is just nonsensical.
But his arc sucks.
Yeah. But Thor is one of the most lovable Avengers. He's just such a nice guy. They have the party scene, Thor has some of the funniest moments in the scene. Like, just his little reactions to the way Rhodey will be telling a story, and he'll be like, oh, yeah, like, oh, that was it. Like, because he's so used to such epic battles and such. Chris Hemsworth, I think, is a little underrated in the role. But to Thor stuff, yeah, his stuff's all cut up and chopped. And, yeah, if we could just judge it on the theatrical release. The excuse, like, oh, well, the director's cut's coming out. The movie we saw didn't make everyone happy, and that's why we're talking about it. I totally agree with that. But I do think that it works in terms of the movie, because the whole movie does feel like a middle piece, but I feel in a good way. I don't think it's an Iron Man 2 type situation. I think it's... even Empire Strikes Back kind of doesn't work on its own,
It doesn't, and I'm actually... This is going to probably alienate a good chunk of anyone who's listening. I'm not an Empire Strikes Back guy. I think A New Hope is great. I don't really like Empire Strikes Back. But neither does Joss Whedon, which is the most ironic part in all this. He said, I don't want a final battle where it's just a bunch of mindless minions fighting against the Avengers. That's exactly what we got. And he said, I don't want to do an Empire Strikes Back. I don't really like that movie. I don't think it has a beginning and an end. It's sort of just in the middle, which is exactly what Age of Ultron is. So I feel like he sort of failed on both the things he specifically addressed prior to the film.
And I will counter with that in a moment. But I think... The real heart of the movie is Hawkeye, and his human connection with his family, and that little reveal, I think, plays so well with a large audience, because it's like no one really cares about Hawkeye, or at least in the movies. I'm a big fan of Matt Fraction's run. Then this happened, and it's like, oh wow, he's got this whole little secret life. This is what he's been doing when he's not off superheroing and nonsensical stuff. It kind of reminds you what the Avengers are fighting for, for people. And I think that's tied in well. I think that, and the fact that they all start referring to themselves as monsters, besides Hawkeye, they all look at themselves in the Visions, and this is where the Visions work for me. They all look at their biggest fears. Tony Stark's vision in the beginning, I think, does call back his Iron Man 3 arc, but I'm okay with that, because in Iron Man 3 they also established that Tony he's a mechanic. He will fix things. He can't stop fixing things. And here... now he fixes things too much. He's starting to fix stuff that's not broken, or at least not in a sense that needed to be fixed in a way. He's over-fixing things, and he's overcompensating, and then he creates this manifestation of all the Avengers' fears in Ultron.
He does, but I gotta say, I'm not... you could, yeah, sure, certainly you can make the argument... I would say even in Iron Man 2, we learned about a new facet of Tony's character. We see him evolve in each film, even the Avengers, where he learns, oh, well, maybe I need to, be a part of this.
Mm-hmm.
Need to be more of a team player than I've been. So we see this, and we see growth in Iron Man 3. I think a lot of this movie really negates that. I mean, it's not similar to. It is the same plot. It's the same. He literally talks about in the third movie. He says, this is a quote from the end of the movie. He says, my journey has reached its end. We start with something pure, something exciting, and then come the mistakes, the compromises. We create our own demons. My armor was never a distraction or a hobby. It was a cocoon, and now I'm a changed man. Literally says these words. Mm-hmm. And then in Age of Ultron, I see a suit of armor around the world. Okay, well, literally the entirety of Iron Man 3 is about separating the iron from the man and talking about the human behind the suit, and that the suit is not the answer, that there's a false sense of security in that sort of thing, and that he does it again without really... It's not like, oh, I fell into the same trap. It feels like a rehash, and even worse, like it's almost ignoring what happened in Iron Man 3. I mean, there's no acknowledgement of anything that happened in Iron Man 3 except for... No, I don't think there's any acknowledgement of anything that happened in Iron Man 3, and that's too bad, because it makes Tony Stark into even more of an interesting character than he had been, back in Iron Man 1, So we've seen this crazy, cool evolution, mm-hmm. and we don't get that here. We in fact get him doing the same thing again with far less effect. I think it's much more effective in Iron Man 3.
Well, I think the repeat of the stuff from Iron Man 3 is only the kicking off point for his arc in Avengers Age of Ultron, because ultimately it comes to him butting to heads with Steve Rogers. Steve Rogers sees the Avengers as a prolonged force for good, defending the Earth. Tony Stark sees them as a temporary fix until he can figure something out, because, like I mentioned, he's a fixer. He tries to fix things too often, and now he broke everything, literally. And so I think that's why that farm scene, I don't know how you feel about the farm in general, but the scene where Tony and Steve are chopping wood, and then they have...
That's a great scene.
Yeah.
That is a great scene. And it's probably the best ad for Civil War I've seen, the best publicity they have for it. When that scene leaked on YouTube well before this movie came out, I loved it. It's really well done. The farm itself, the introduction of Hawkeye's family, I was already sympathetic to him. I already liked his relationship with Widow, so I wasn't... This sort of came out of left field, and I didn't love it when I first saw it. At this point, I'm sort of just lukewarm to it. But I do like the wood chopping scene is great.
Yeah, and I love what Robert Downey Jr. said when he was interviewed about that. The scene could only work if they were both right, and ultimately they are. It's just the Avengers is more than just about them, and so Tony doesn't fit in this little mechanism anymore, and so by the end of the movie, he fixes up what he caused, the damage he caused, or sort of. I mean, the world's in shambles still, but he decided it's not for him anymore. He can't work like this. So I think Iron Man 3 is his personal journey. Avengers Age of Ultron is his journey with the rest of the Avengers and wrapping that up. And now in Phase 3, he'll be more antagonistic, which I think is a really interesting way to take that character.
Well, I also don't feel like they really set that up, though. That's what's interesting. To some degree, but they didn't really set up any sort of animosity between any of the Avengers. So I'm curious. We can't talk about Civil War until it comes out, of course, but I'm curious to see how that actually is executed. But I do want to just want to hammer the point home a little bit, that it's the same arc, because... And it's important because it's not just Tony Stark. In fact, we learn at the end of Iron Man 3 in this funny little scene, but in fact it's actually quite consequential, that Bruce Banner is the person he's been telling this whole story to. Now, Bruce Banner is many things. He is apparently able to work with Tony Stark to develop artificial intelligence, which makes no sense, even though he's supposedly a nuclear physicist and a biochemist. No information about him being a programmer of some sort. I don't know how any of that makes sense, but let's leave that aside. And while he's not a psychologist, he is fully aware of Tony's entire arc in Iron Man 3. He tells him point blank, and he does fall asleep. This is the person who enables him to do exactly what got him into trouble the first time. And I find it so weird that someone would... I mean, on some level you get it. Okay, so... Banner's trying to come up with a way not to have to engage with the Hulk anymore because he doesn't like the Hulk and he doesn't like to have to be the Hulk. But in another, he's watched Iron Man 3, to put it in sort of simple terms, and still says, you know what, we're going to go with your idea because your idea is, and it's not just a new idea. It's not like a new idea from a brilliant mind who messed up once. It's the same idea. Let's try it again. And then after even when you screw up the first time in the movie, we're going to then engage with you again so we can make the Vision, who turns out to be a good idea, but only there's no explanation for why he thinks this will work or why it would be valuable to, give the Vision life or any of this information. And his willingness to go along with it is even more bizarre, I feel, almost than Tony repeating the same mistakes he made in Iron Man 3. So that whole thing just didn't rub me the right way. It almost feels like Age of Ultron was written, or the arcs were written before they had a solid idea of what they were doing for Iron Man 3. I don't know.
No, well, I still disagree on that, but I think you bring up some good points, even though I still disagree on.
Even though you're wrong.
Even though you're wrong, I think you bring up some good points. No, I never thought about the Bruce Banner bit though. That does raise some questions.
He is asleep. To be fair, he is asleep. He does wake up, so maybe he didn't hear the part where everything went wrong.
Yeah, because he was fixing everything incessantly. But on the Captain America front of the Tony Stark and Steve Rogers debates, as he sees the Avengers as a lifelong force for good to protect the Earth, he still has no home, and that's why I think his vision is, in particular, so heartbreaking. We all know he's man out of time and such, but he's really lost everything. He really does have nothing. Winter Soldier gets that point pretty well too.
I was going to say, we saw that in Winter Soldier. Uh-huh. That's the whole theme of that movie.
Mm-hmm. But now we're just picking up the end tail of that, and then the movie moves on with that. And in Winter Soldier, he decides it's again the personal story, as the Marvel movies I think do pretty well. That his fight is looking for Bucky. Among many other things, for being a constant force for good, he's looking for Bucky now. He's going to go look for his best friend. And
right, but that's not. But that's not really and that's what's so strange about this movie. I mean, it's interesting you would even bring Captain America up, because I don't feel like he has an arc. He pays lip service to the Bucky search when he's talking to Falcon, but there's no. That's it. That's it. And then the rest of it is he serves as an antagonist a little bit to Tony Stark, or the protagonist, Tony Stark's antagonist, however you want to look at it. But beyond that, he's really just I feel like set dressing, where he wasn't in the first movie. I think he was more of a uniter, and an interesting piece, because as Joss Whedon said, he was the in for the audience. He was the character who had no idea what was going on, and so he was supposed to represent the person who hadn't seen any of the Marvel movies yet. In this case, I feel like without that, he had very little to work with, especially since they couldn't do any Bucky stuff, which is why Civil War might work. I don't know, because that will deal with a lot of Bucky stuff.
He's a big part of that movie, from what I hear. But I think his arc, again, is tied to the Avengers and establishing them that they're going to be around for a while. Whether or not personal people are going to fall in and out, he's going to be there to lead the team through thick or thin. And I think the movie does ultimately a good job of that, too. I mean, yeah, there's the code end tales of the Winter Soldier stuff about him trying to find his new place in the world. He's found his new place in the world. Now he's just firmly establishing it, I guess. That's the point I'm feeling. I guess let's talk about the Vision, though, because I really disagree. I think without the Vision, the movie doesn't work. At least in regards to Ultron.
It's weird. His scenes, after he's born, his scenes are good. I almost wish he existed earlier in the story. I wish, how cool. I feel like something to very much simplify what was to simplify his birth would have made things so much better. Cut out the Thor stuff. Who cares? That whole thing is just, it doesn't mean anything to me. But instead, to have Tony, he sees Ultron made, and then as a desperate attempt to maybe correct his mistake without the rest of the Avengers knowing, he goes and he, on his own, develops the Vision to sort of be a countermeasure, which shows that he's not evil. He's not trying to, but he does, and it happens the same way. But it happens after this very convoluted. Oh, Ultron's uploading into him. Oh no, he's not. Oh, he's really made of vibranium, and it's mixed with organic material. This whole thing that's just, it's irrelevant. And this whole side plot, which was to get Chinese budget, that's the whole reason that they had this whole partnership with China, to my understanding, to help with financing the film. That's why that whole subplot about the skin grafting thing was in there.
Oh, wasn't that in Korea though?
I thought it was in China.
No, South Korea. No.
Or is
Iron
it?
Man
Oh,
3
that was a
had
different
subplots
character.
in South Korea in China that were cut in the American release.
I thought there was another character in this movie that was cut out, that was in a Chinese cut of it, or was that Iron Man 3?
That was Iron Man 3.
Okay, all right. Well, anyway, we'll scratch that. But it doesn't matter. The point is, there's this whole complicated thing, and I would be fine with it if he developed a separate robot who he installed Jarvis on, or he had a backup copy of Jarvis or something. And that we got a lot more of Ultron and Vision, because in fact, I agree with you, it's what makes Ultron even remotely interesting in the last half of the movie, because mostly he's not, I don't think. After the scene with Claw, where you get some good lines in and you get some more, James Spader stuff, it's mostly just kind of a nothing villain to me. It's not as funny. He's more just, do this now because it'll move the plot forward, do this now. And to have his interactions with, between Vision and Ultron, which even at least in Earth's Mightiest Heroes, is always one of the more interesting relationships, that would have been much cooler, but they get very little interaction, and I feel like that would have been a much better use of time. It would have introduced him sooner, and it would have cut out this whole Thor subplot, which, again, is only there to support the next Thor movie. I mean, I don't see any other way to look at it.
You're not wrong, but I think the Thor subplot, or for the Thor subplot, I mean,
Right.
Vision, that's a whole other thing. It's like there's elements of it that could work. I do not mind it, actually, to be honest, but I think there's not enough there to grab onto beyond, like, filling in the blanks for yourself, and an audience shouldn't have to do that. So you're not wrong on that one, but it does work for me, even though it is just setting up Thor 3 and Infinity Wars and the Infinity Stone stuff. But again, because this is the middle piece, and it feels like there's a larger game we know there's a large game being played with the Marvel movies.
And the whole connection to the Infinity Stone. I mean, did Ultron really need to be connected to the Infinity Stones?
Oh, not at all. No.
The Mind Gem is a computer. Why is it a computer? That doesn't make any sense. What?
No.
Why
I
is
think
this?
They were saying literal computer. I think it was just like.
It's some sort of AI type thing that they used
it
to
was
base
higher
Ultron
than like
on.
any sort of calibration they were able to.
It's a brain.
Do
It's
a
something, right?
Yeah.
But it was just confusing. It was why, but even with all that, and here's I guess my problem with the Vision Ultron stuff is that it's very interesting. I would love the idea of Ultron and Vision fighting over, humanity's worth saving. No, humanity's not worth saving. It's almost biblical, and it's what is the value in humanity. It's a really cool idea, but it doesn't really tie into what the Avengers are talking about. Then that's really the problem, is it's a completely different theme. You could have an Ultron movie where it's about the Vision and Ultron's differing views on humanity, both created by humans, but both have very different perspectives. I don't know how that fits in with what you're talking about with Captain America and Iron Man, which is a completely separate argument. It feels like, again, another... And this all adds to it's the convolutedness of it. It's all so mixed and mished and moshed together into something that becomes thematically unclear. And that's what I was so surprised at when I saw people talking about the film. They're like, it's it may not be as action heavy as the first Avengers, but it's more thematically interesting. And I'm like, but it's so convoluted. The first one is very simple, sure, but it's
streamlined.
It's simple.
Thematics.
It's streamlined, and I think that there's something to be said for that. Mad Max is a streamlined film.
Oh yeah,
there's no complexity.
Of the decade.
It's right. We both love that film, right?
Oh, yeah.
Excellent film, but it's simple, and a movie does not need to throw 4,000 themes at you for it to be interesting per se. It can be complicated. I'm all for complicated, if it makes sense. But in this case, it just felt like. It was a lot of throwing things at the wall to see what stuck, and to me, it just didn't pan out.
And then I'm on the flip side of that. I think because of how they view the Avengers, the differences with Tony Stark and Steve Rogers. Steve Rogers fighting them, again, protect Earth, yada yada. Tony Stark is fallen apart, fallen to pieces. Poor bastard has been through so much. And then Vision is born amidst that huge fight that's a little hard to follow on rewatch. But he's born into chaos, essentially. Like everyone's just literally throwing shit at each other. And so he's an innocent though, because he's just born. He's gaining.
He's almost like a child.
Yeah, and actually, I think that's why he's able to lift Thor's hammer. I think if he had been around as long as any of them, I don't think he would have been worthy. I think just his purity as a newborn is what allows him to... That's a whole other theory thing, never mind. But I think that ties into the prodigal son aspect of Ultron and how he's a huge failure, obviously. I mean, people are dead, lots of them. But for Vision and Ultron's little discussions, they probably did need more time to just debate the pros and cons of man, because their final scene, without that, I don't think I would have been as positive on the movie as I am.
That's so interesting. That was this, because I like that scene, but it feels ancillary to the central idea, which is about Tony Stark's, again, rehashed plot. To me, that's a very separate thing, and that's what I find frustrating, because there's a lot of things that could have been really interesting in this film, but it was more focused on doing things like setting up Phase 3 and setting up all these other things that I feel like that got in the way of good storytelling. I mean, just on the most basic level. And it's frustrating when there are movies that, can do that, retain their simplicity and also be interesting and without feeling like they're just setting up what's next. And of course, Josh Rosenfield would argue that's every Marvel movie. I would argue that's not every Marvel movie. There are elements of them that, of course, are setups for the next whatever is coming out. But ultimately, most of these films work well enough on their own that you could watch them on their own. And I don't think Age of Ultron fits that at all. What I really want to get with this film is I want to find someone who really has only seen Age of Ultron. Or maybe saw the first Avengers. Because how could you follow anything that's going on? It's nonsensical. Whereas if you gave them Guardians of the Galaxy, which is my current favorite Marvel film, the movie just makes sense on its own. Iron Man 3 makes sense on its own. Even though it's building from previous films, you don't need them to understand it. Age of Ultron is just it's not... It's clouded. It's a cloudy mix of fan service, setting up the next phase, and then its own storytelling, which I think ultimately takes, third or fourth row to the rest of the focuses of the film.
See, I don't know. I mean, on its own, like that's an interesting discussion to have. But if the movie's not designed to be standing on its own, I don't know if we should hold that against the movie.
Oh yeah, but I don't find that compelling. Like it's not a. The only film I could really see that you making that argument about is something like, one of the Lord of the Rings films, which, because they were shot together, is really, I mean, you could almost look at it as one long film. But even then, those movies do work on their own. They introduce the characters through, not necessarily by telling, but through action. The Two Towers is the middle film there, and yet it offers a satisfying conclusion. It offers an interesting beginning. It makes sense. Oh, these characters are captured. Oh, there's this big battle. Oh, they barely won it. This character, died, but now he's back to... It works well enough on its own that it doesn't necessarily need to be part of a franchise, although I do think it works better. But even then, those were all shot together. Age of Ultron, if it worked as a sequel to Avengers even, I would understand that. But there's so much that's lifted and referenced and set up that I don't think it really does. And I feel like it would be utterly confusing to anyone who's not following the Marvel Universe on screen.
Yeah, I'm still going to disagree with that. I think specifically to Avengers, to Age of Ultron, I think it would be comprehensible. I think this movie is definitely messy on the first few. It's bursting at the seams with too much at times, but repeated viewings, I feel more confident in saying that it definitely is one of my favorites still. But again, I want to go back to the scene with Ultron and Vision at the end, because that's almost kind of meta about how I view the movie. Like Ultron saying they're doomed, they all screwed up, and then Vision replies, "Yeah, they are doomed. But something isn't beautiful because it lasts or it's perfect." It's just that dialogue exchange really got me thinking about the movie as a whole. I was like, yeah, you know what? There's not a lot that I dislike about it. I think you clearly feel opposite about that, or at least lukewarm. But it has enough for me to talk about, even if it doesn't all work cohesively together, that I can't help but at least warranted further viewings and further discussions. I think it's a movie that ultimately does have merit to it, regardless of its flaws. And I hope that in the long run, more people at least go back to it. Maybe not to change their opinion on it, but at least talk about it. Because I think that's why it's one of my favorites, is at least getting people to talk about what they do and don't like about it.
What's funny is that we got into this discussion because I think it was because I was surprised you really enjoyed it or something. Or we were talking about Iron Man 3, I think.
Which is better than this movie, by the way.
Which is better than this movie. We can both agree on that. But until that point, I hadn't even thought about. I mean, it totally went out of my mind after I saw it. I think people. I've completely forgotten about this film until I had to rewatch it for this podcast. It's unmemorable, and I think I might even be on the same page as you. If it was like, oh, it threw all these ideas, they didn't all work, more didn't work than did, fine. If they weren't redundant, but to me, a lot of them feel like it's not even new ideas in the context of the Marvel Universe, and that's not saying much because the Marvel Universe doesn't have a whole lot of new ideas. But when I feel like the central plot is Iron Man 3, in terms of Tony Stark's arc, for example, or to be more specific, it takes away that's one of the major ideas or themes in this film. And so if all of the new ideas that were sort of blended together in this film if all of the ideas had been new, that would have been one thing, but a lot of them felt like retreads. And so whatever merit it might have had for trying that more experimental approach, which again, that's really stretching my praise of the film, it loses that too, because it doesn't feel like new. It feels like, old ideas rehashed and not really done all that much differently.
All right, well, I still disagree with it, but you do raise interesting points of discussion that I have to reiterate on another viewing, because I will absolutely watch this movie again at least a couple more times this year. But
and I will too, just with the idea of the Vision Ultron dynamic in mind. I just don't think until Vision is born, which is towards the end of the movie, that those themes are at all engaged with, and so therefore it feels like a really great idea. Joss Whedon had the end of the script that he wasn't able to explore more, and was like, "Oh, I'm not going to rewrite the whole film to be about this," even though that might have been led to a much better film. But I will look for seeds of that idea as I upon rewatch, if I do end up rewatching it as often as you seem to.
Yeah, I also want to touch on the theme of legacy. That one is mostly sprinkled in, but I think it's also served with the characters of the twins, and then we'll start wrapping up because this is going on for a while, and I think you got to watch Ant-Man.
I that actually got canceled, so I am a bit more free. But yes.
Oh, okay, great. How Tony Stark's origin starts with the missile in the Middle East, and how he almost dies from his own hand, right? The twins are basically the dark other prodigal children of Tony Stark, and how his weapons almost led them to their own death, to kill their parents, and so they have that grudge against him. Now, I wish they had a more precise conclusion to those three character story arcs, but in the long run, I think that's an interesting way to take those characters and how they're allowed to develop their own personalities and their own story with Tony Stark, even if it doesn't have quite the finite ending I wish it did.
It's interesting you say this, and it's different than the comics.
Yeah,
I will say I'm not sold on their relationship with Tony Stark. Their animosity towards him I wasn't sold on that. I like the way you just framed it. Sounds great. I wish the film had been, I don't know, shown that more than we got a big exposition scene where where Quicksilver tells this whole thing to Ultron. But to me, that's not as. We weren't shown anything. We weren't given any more than that. And by the way, we've seen a lot of this on Agent Carter, where people are trying to, like this was Stark tech. It's Stark's fault. It's even in the MCU, we've seen this on multiple occasions. But all of that aside, I will say I do like Scarlet Witch. I do like Quicksilver. We definitely agree. I not to put words in your mouth, but we definitely agree that this Quicksilver at least is more integral to the plot, a little bit better immersed in the story than Quicksilver in Days of Future Past, who has a great scene, but shows up and then disappears because he would break the film. I'm very curious to see how he interacts at all in Apocalypse. So I will say that, and I didn't mind the characters. I just they didn't have as much fleshing out as I would have liked, and I'm a little sad that now Quicksilver is dead, so we're not going to get any more of that. But I did like that. I feel like they had a lot of potential. Which I guess is the most you can say for characters who don't have all that many lines. So I'm hoping that in the future we'll get more developments for, say, Scarlet Witch, and even some of the side characters from the other films who are now part of the new Avengers or whatever they're doing. But I did like their character arc. So that's not actually one of my quibbles of the film. I will say that.
All right, cool. Because I really like those characters, even though they didn't have that much to do. Scarlet Witch, I think
she had even less to do than Quicksilver. I mean, she barely was a character.
I think
she did things. She did the Vision things, but she didn't have very much dialogue. I didn't feel like she developed as much as a character, which is funny because I think a lot of people feel that way about Quicksilver. But at least he, I don't know, had lines of dialogue, seemed to interact with other characters. His big final moment is saving someone, whereas Scarlet Witch's biggest moment is, I guess we could argue about that, but yeah. She deals with Ultron at the very end, which was kind of a good scene, but even that felt unearned. I mean, their relationship between, I didn't believe their siblingness all that much. They didn't sell their relationship on the level that I might have wanted for the moment where she takes Ultron's quote unquote heart out. That was kind of hard for me to empathize with, because I didn't feel like their relationship was as tight as she seemed to be implying it was.
Okay, that's interesting, because I think ultimately this movie is a bunch of, for me, great stuff with me wanting it to be expanded upon, because I feel the same way. Like the moments for me works. I wish I had seen more stuff with them together, with the trio of villains. Before it's just Ultron against the world.
Or even just Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. Because I like that heart scene. It feels like it could have been very impactful. But it just, to me, because they never built them as a duo even. Forget about the trio. We didn't even get them as a duo. Is kind of hard. Literally all we saw them do before they somehow are called by Ultron, I don't know how that works, is them fighting the Avengers in the woods. But that's about it. So it was kind of hard for me to believe this intense sibling connection that they supposedly have, which I know in the comics is very prevalent.
Yeah.
Perhaps too prevalent.
Sometimes, there's some iterations where it's a little Game of Thronesy. And I'm not about
in the Ultimates.
Ultimate, I'm not a fan of that personally. But I think they help develop the legacy theme along with Ultron Vision, of course, and ultimately the final moment where the new Avengers are assembled, and that's just on a blockbuster type reaction. That's a really kick-ass lineup. I really like that lineup of characters.
It is, and again, it's like we're spending all. It's another great potential moment, right? So it's a cool. You're like, oh, this is a cool lineup. I can't wait to see when those characters get to do something cool. Which again is just set up for Phase 3 or for Civil War, for whatever happens next. And moreover, it just even more clearly illustrates the fact that we've watched however many movies with, this very arguably boring, cast in terms of diversity and gender and all these other things. And so it's a cool scene on its own. In the context of the movie, it almost points out how the movie is just setting up other things, and B, how we've watched, now 2 phases worth of characters who are not always the most interesting to watch, and certainly are not the most diverse or interesting cast in the history of blockbuster films. So I do like the scene. I do, and I like how it's cut off before he says "Avengers Assemble." It's cute. But it reaffirmed my personal feeling, which is that I'm not excited for another Marvel movie until I think Black Panther comes out. I don't care about any of the other ones that are coming out. It's not interesting to me, and I shouldn't feel that way because I love the Marvel universe. It should be so much more interesting, but because it feels so whitewashed. It's so bland. They had all of Phase 2 to introduce new characters, and they really didn't. That it feels this was almost like thumbing it in your face. Like, look, we've finally got these other cast members, and you don't get to see them again until Phase 3. Haha. That's what it felt like. So, but I am excited for this lineup. It does seem cool, even from a comic book perspective. This is cool. This is what we wanted to see.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to just reiterate the legacy thing, because I think, while ultimately that's just... You're probably right about behind-the-scenes stuff, saying, okay, we'll plant this for future movies. I do feel that Joss Whedon had enough of a deft writing hand to build on it on its own, even though it's the Empire Strikes Back thing, where it's not really ending anything. I think the opening and closing scenes are like a prologue and epilogue, but the middle Ultron stuff is ultimately the story of the movie, where they have to face their own fears, they have to look at their new lives, they have to go their separate ways, because ultimately the movie is a little melancholy, it's a little sad. These guys don't get together when they're not saving the world. They will shoot at each other, they will throw things at each other. One of them is going to probably end up in space or some island in the Bahamas. Another one's going back to Asgard because he lost sight of his responsibilities to his own people. Some of them just have differing ideals about how they go about heroing and saving people. And for me, that's what makes the film work. All these different ideas, while they don't all connect as cohesively as the streamlined stuff in the first Avengers or even the Winter Soldier, which isn't that streamlined of a movie, but it handles different ideas cohesively.
Oh, I disagree with that. I actually think it's very streamlined, very very clear film in terms of what it's about. But I just want to go back and I just want to point something out. You mentioned the first scene in the movie. I forgot to even mention this. Not only do I think that's the best scene in the movie, I think the opening sequence is awesome. I think all the character dynamics are really spot on. The swearing, Captain America swearing thing was supposed to be funny. I still don't find it funny. It feels very corny. And when they keep alluding to it later, I'm like, oh god, it wasn't funny the first time. So that didn't work for me. But I thought it was shot well. It was cool. All the characters played off each other just right. There was an immediate homage to the scene where Thor and Captain America fought in the first film, where the hammer hits the shield and they use it to knock a bunch of guys over. It's very cool. Widow and Hulk interact with the lullaby the first time. There's no romantic pretense at all there. It's only shoehorned suddenly into the bar scene later on, because before that they're talking about, you don't even trust me and all this other stuff. It feels very platonic, and then the bar scene, all of a sudden it's romantic. But in this opening scene, it's very well done, and I actually really liked it. And I also just want to point out, I really liked Baron von Strucker, who, I don't know if he died, the guy with the eye. Oh
yeah, he dies. Ultron kills him. He sends him that footage from the prison
cell. Oh, right, which is too bad, because he has like one or two really funny lines in this intro, and he's so... I wanted to know more about him, and then he dies, and I know in the comics he's a bit more of a character, but he doesn't have much to do in Age of Ultron except for, this intro sequence, which is a little bit... It's too bad, because he could have been really cool. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there, that there are things about this movie I do like. One of them is this intro sequence.
Yeah, I think the intro is fantastic as well, especially the opening shot with...
It's also the best action scene, I think. I mean, I think it's the best shot action sequence in the film. The Hulk thing it's just tiresome. It's very brown and boring, and just not... The color palette's very unappetizing. And then the final fight, it's very gray, and there's robots everywhere, but the robots aren't fun to watch blow up over and over again, so it's not all that fun. I really liked this first scene, even though it's more Hydra and stuff. And I like the sense of camaraderie that you get in the team. To me, that was... There was more said in that sequence than in actual long-winded diatribes about what the Avengers are and what they should be that we get later on. That was more impactful to me, that opening sequence, which, again, if you feel like that's the apex, then it just feels like everything else is sort of a slow slide down as the rest of the movie
puts
goes
in
on.
Perspective to me more your thoughts, like that.
Right.
In your season, I'm like, oh wow. No,
yeah.
But, yeah, I mean, I think it's a great scene as well. The party scene, I think, is probably my favorite. But onto the final action sequence, and then start wrapping up. I thought I was going to get tired of the robots being smashed to bits too, and I sort of was, up until the point where Scarlet Witch bursts out the door and she gets that big hero moment when she saves Hawkeye. The way that was filmed, and the soundtrack, Danny Elfman score. The Brian Tyler stuff in this movie is whatever, middle of the road at best. But the Danny Elfman score, I think, has a lot of fun. It's got a lot of pizzazz, if that's a word. And it makes the movie feel more alive to me. Specifically, we talked about it a little bit earlier, the scene when Ultron asks the Avengers, "This is exactly what I wanted. How on earth are you going to stop me?" And then Tony turns to Steve and he goes, like the old man said, together. And then you get that 360 shot. That scene, every time I watch it, gets me a little more giddy and excited. The last time I took my younger cousin, and I was like jumping up and down on my seat, clapping, applauding. I couldn't help it. And even like trying to be, or being absolutely objective about it, I think that scene reiterates just how great these characters are together. And
that is
why the
so
Avengers
funny.
are so important in this universe. But these characters ultimately will not work together outside of that.
In that sequence, I was just done with the film. And it's really funny that you liked it so much, because they had alienated me from the characters I liked by either pretending like Phase 2 didn't happen or underwriting them to the point where they're basically non-characters. I felt like that was the case with Steve Rogers. With Tony Stark, as I've pointed out many times, I feel like it sort of ignored a lot of his arc in Iron Man 3. Black Widow, I felt like they'd really reduced what they had built to be a very interesting and cool character in The Winter Soldier to a very boring character in that movie. And then they'd introduced a whole bunch of new characters we hadn't spent much time with. So what we got was this, long, with this epic score of them, this 360, oh, look at how cool these characters are. And I felt like I was watching a bunch of strangers, which is a thing I never felt watching the first Avengers film. And that to me is the core of and why this movie represents overall a failure on the part of the filmmakers. Well, really, Joss Whedon, I guess, in this case, but also the studio, who plays a role in all of this. In that, I felt so detached from what was going on that to have this scene just felt like, again, you went thumbing it in your eye. It's like, look at these characters, aren't they cool? We told you they were cool, so they're cool. Like Vision and Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, but they hadn't earned it. And a lot of the characters that we had come to know and really like, they had reduced in a really sad way to a point where I barely recognize them. So for me, this scene is either if you're on board with what's going on, I can see how it could be really appealing. But I was so not on board with what was going on that by the time this scene came up, I was ready to be done.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. We're on the
That's
exact
really interesting.
opposite sides of that.
About that scene, yeah. It just felt gratuitous,
Yeah, okay. If from where you're coming from, I could see why. I'm going to end on a negative note, actually, because this movie brought up something that I didn't have an issue with the Phase 2 movies. The color correction is pretty terrible in this movie. I really hate it. I can't stand it.
It didn't hurt. It didn't hurt the whole film. It's weird because the color palettes change as the film goes on. There's a very cool aesthetic to the opening, and it works fine. I think the snowy landscape.
Yeah, for the snowy stuff, it works.
But the Hulk and the whole Hulk scene in South Africa, which by the way, my dad's from South Africa. I've been there. It doesn't look like that. I don't know why everything had to be orange and brown. The red soil thing, that's a thing. It was a very strange choice, and it's not just the environment; it's also the characters themselves are almost washed in this, and it just doesn't. It's not appealing. It feels like Call of Duty or something. And
I can't stand it. And if this is the route they're going to go with the Marvel movies from now on, that's going to be my prolonged issue with the series.
But it's not, though, right? You saw I haven't seen it yet, but you saw Ant-Man, and that's not.
Ant-Man sort of has it, mostly in the opening stuff with Scott Lang's character. No spoilers, of course, but it's kind of there. Everything shot at night, it doesn't suffer from it. Everything during the day, for the most part, has it, and it's becoming a serious issue for me. And that's probably like the 50th thing on your list of issues.
Right, and that was actually, I think, again, going back to Josh, I think that was one of the things he was most irritated about with the film and I was like, that was last on my list of complaints, but yeah, it was, I didn't love so what exactly is your complaint about it, just to be clear?
This is a movie that should be the most vibrant, colorful, exciting blockbuster of the year, and then Mad Max Fury Road, a post-apocalyptic wasteland action adventure movie has one of the most visually appealing color palettes I've ever seen in a movie. It should be the opposite. What
Right.
the hell happened?
Right. Okay, interesting. All right, so yeah, I feel the same way that this, and what's funny is this is the kind of thing that it just, to the average moviegoer, apparently doesn't matter, because if you want to talk about color palette problems, Jurassic World is way worse than Age of Ultron. It's just blue for an entire film. It's really hard to watch.
You're not wrong.
Right, yeah, it was irritating. But apparently it's, on its way to beat the Avengers to become the third highest grossing film of all time. As we speak, it probably is crossing that line.
Oh god.
So I don't know. While this bothers me on some level, and it does exhaust you visually, it makes you not, this is a long movie. That's the other thing. It's really long. And to have to sit through this, through muddy visual palettes like that, it makes it more exhausting. I mean, I was yawning. I didn't want to be there, and I had been looking forward to the film. And that's not something you want to be. And this was at the Hulk scene, which is maybe halfway through the film. So, yeah, I agree with you.
Really quick, I'm going to read out some tweets. At the Ryan McLean says he thinks it's better than Age of Ultron is better than the first, though nowhere near as crowd pleasing, which I completely agree. And then Thor 2 and Cap 2 are better, 50-50, because I don't like Thor 2 anymore. I did for a little bit, and then I rewatched it, and I realized how terribly wrong I was. Ditto for Ant-Man also, but that's something else worth talking about. Aaron Smith's film says it's not in reference to being one of the best Marvel movies. It's just okay.
Interesting. I will say just quickly about Thor 2. I think it's better than the first. I think it's definitely one of the weaker Marvel films. But it has some things going for it. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I feel the opposite, because I feel that Thor has whatever story...
I can't even remember Thor, to be honest.
Whatever story imaginations fail in the movie, I think the character stuff is really strong. I think if you ever have the chance to revisit it, or you ever get an itch for it, I don't know if you will, because people who don't like it just never watch it again. I think the character stuff really works.
I have no reason to revisit either Thor film, to be honest. At this point, I'm done with that world. I'll see Ragnarok, but I don't know.
Joseph White says it's one of their only good ones. I think nonsense.
About Age of Ultron?
About Age of Ultron.
Wow.
Yeah. I can only imagine. I'm flabbergasted. I can only imagine how you're feeling right now. At Hector J. I enjoyed Age of Ultron quite a bit, actually. There's a lot of you guys. Okay, I'd put it in the better half of them, says at A_B_Allen. And then that's all I'm going to read, because this is kind of a mess.
Okay.
There's a lot of you guys. But
sure.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining me, Soren.
Yeah. I just want to throw this out there as a response to these people, is that maybe it says something to the Marvel Universe that they are so desperate for difference that when something is bad but different, it feels like it's so much farther ahead of other Marvel films. I know that people like Josh, for example, again, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he said this to me, that it feels very homogenized and there's no sense of artistic vision in these films. And so maybe because it was so different, this is what people are responding to. I would counter that Iron Man 3, Captain America Winter Soldier are very different films than what we got in the first phase, which was a lot of origin stories. So I just want to throw that as maybe a possible explanation.
I agree with you, even though I'm still positive on the film. Because, I think the complaint that these are all the same movie, or they have the same vibe about them, or they're all samey, whatever, I think that's doohickey. I think with Iron Man 2 and Thor 2, those are samey movies, even though they're totally different genres, pretty much. They have the same cut, paste, edit, committee feel to them that I can't stand. I will defend every other one. I will even defend Thor. So take that, world. Yeah, okay, but seriously, thank you so much for talking, man. I very much enjoyed our differing discussions on this, because, yeah, that's probably why I like the movie even more. I'm getting a lot of good discussions with people out of this one.
Well, hey, I mean, if it's doing it for you, then it's doing it for you. Far be it from me to tell anyone what's good and what's not. This is my perspective. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Soren Hough, SorenHough. You can also follow MovieFail at MovieFailBlog. Again, it was a pleasure having this conversation.
Yeah, thanks. I'd love to do it again sometime. And
Sounds
of course,
good.
guys, you can always catch me at the Waffle Press on YouTube, the Waffle Press Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, my personal Twitter, Dago Waffles. Catch me stuff. What the hell was that? Catch my stuff at audienceeverywhere.net. And plenty of other podcasts down. Links in the YouTube doobity doo. We have been the Waffle Press Podcast. We've been professionally unprofessional.